Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Toledo Museum of Art and our historic Peristyle Theater. I'm Scott Boberg, Manager of Programs here at the museum, and I am truly honored to be the host for the evening tonight. This Masterworks lecture, part of an ongoing series we do here at the museum, and tonight it's with collectors Charles and Valerie Diker, with David W. Penney, curator of the exhibition, on the occasion of which we are all gathered here, Indigenous Beauty, Masterworks of American Indian Art from the Diker collection, which is on view officially starting tomorrow and running through May 8th. But all of you here in the audience tonight will have the amazing opportunity to see this exhibition, which is utterly beautiful, following this event. So please join us in Canada Gallery and see this wonderful show. I just want to take a moment to just go over a few housekeeping details. I have my cell phone out, not because I'm taking any calls, but it is to remind myself to remind you to just set your phone to silent so it doesn't go off during this presentation. Also, if anyone needs to use the restroom, I know we have a number of visitors from out of town and want to direct you. In case you need a restroom, they're on the lower level, so you can exit either of these doors and work your way back around the curving Sol LeWitt mural. The museum is so honored to have Charles and Valerie Diker's collection here for this exhibition, and to introduce and to thank our sponsors for this exhibition and to welcome you all. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Museum Director Brian Kennedy.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What a crowd. Every time I come out here, I just feel like we're being given a big warm hug by Florence Scott Libby, who gave us this extraordinary theater in 1933. It's fabulous to have you all here. It's a special pleasure to welcome Charles and Valerie Diker. Can I invite all the people from Northwest Ohio to make them welcome? We're going to have a conversation after a talk. Charles and Valerie have brought with them a group of guests from New York City, an extraordinary group of guests, and if you don't mind, I want to particularly welcome Leonard and Judy Lauder, Tom Campbell, Director of the Metropolitan Museum, and Anne Temkin from the Museum of Modern Art. I wrote to Glenn Lowry after seeing Anne's exhibition of Picasso sculpture to say this sort of thing happens only once in a decade, where a museum exhibition is so awe-inspiring and translating, and at the same time there was Congo at the Met and there was Frank Stella at the Whitney. Mr. Lauder has done wonderful things for the Whitney and for the Met. Can you make them welcome, please? Museums are made possible by great people, and the staff working in them, of course, relies on a curatorial engine. We're delighted to have David Penney with us, who has curated this exhibition, and Helena Norton Westbrook, our Director of Collections, who's coordinated it here. And it was made possible by American Federation of the Arts, and I want to welcome their Executive Director, Pauline Willis. So please make her welcome. Pauline's back for the second time in a month because they also organized our Rise of Sneaker Culture show, which has been doing wonderful things for our audiences in the last few months. I want to acknowledge our sponsors. The sponsors for this exhibition are very, very important to us. ProMedica, who are a huge employer here, Taylor Cadillac, who do such an extraordinary job in their marketing of what is a great industry of our region, automotive, and Dorothy Mackenzie Price, one of our true, wonderful art legends of this community. And this master series that we started when I came here, which takes place 3 or 4 times a year, is made possible by our Toledo Museum of Art ambassadors and by Yark Automotive. Our ambassadors and Yark have been wonderful to us, but I want our ambassadors to stand up and be acknowledged because they're amazing. Go on. Thank you all. Now, just to say briefly, this exhibition has been part of an exhibition philosophy that was generated around 2010, which was to diversify our exhibition making and take a rather classic museum into areas that it hadn't previously encountered with its audiences. And so we've had a whole sequence of exhibitions crossing cultures. Many of you will remember an extraordinary exhibition of Australian Aboriginal art in 2012. And then we started to explore issues in our local area which are truly important to American history. The Battle of Lake Erie, the sieges of Fort Meigs, which had their bicentenary in 1812, that's 1812, 1813, with just a couple of years ago in 2012, 2013. Remembering the Civil War, a third of the Union Army being from Ohio. And then Indigenous Beauty was part of our agenda, to have an exhibition of Native American art. And what an incredible collection we've been able to bring together, courtesy of Mr. and Mrs. Diker. I mentioned this morning at the press opening, I think it's important to really realize that Native American art is the foundational art of this country, of this nation, and it's made up of many, many nations. And in 1492, scholars reckon there were about 10 million Native Americans in this continent. That number had reduced to about 250,000 people by the 19th century. But today is about 6 million people according to the 2010 census. And most of the works of art in this exhibition, of course, were not actually meant to be displayed in a museum gallery. The exhibition is a beautiful encounter with a whole range of art from all over the country, and that was what was truly important to us, that this collection attempted to represent the makings of Native people all over the country. And so it's a journey round a vast continent in wonderful ways. Visual art is a language. It's a language that has its own vocabulary and its own grammar. And here in the Museum of Art, we're very keen to make sure that it is taught, just as if you were learning Spanish and you needed to understand its alphabet and its vocabulary, its grammar and its construction. And Native America has its languages. It's reckoned many hundreds of languages in the past, but today only 8 indigenous languages are spoken by more than 10,000 people. We heard this before about Australia. Let's help to revive our indigenous languages. Let's celebrate what we're seeing today and understand that speaking languages is truly important, and welcoming people in their own language is the true way to engage their culture. With that said, I want to hand back to Scott Boberg, who will introduce David Penney. Have a great evening, and thanks so much for being here, and I'll be back with the Dikers a little bit later. Thank you very much.
It is my great privilege to introduce David W. Penney. I worked a few years ago at the Detroit Institute of Arts, where David worked for many years, and the Native American collection there and the presentation is truly extraordinary. So it's a pleasure to introduce him here at the Toledo Museum of Art. He is the Associate Director of Museum Scholarship at the National Museum of the American Indian, and he's been there since 2011. In this capacity, he is focused on creating powerful and transformational museum experiences with collections, interpretation, and design. And he is the curator of Indigenous Beauty, Masterworks of American Indian Art from the Diker collection. And you are in for an extraordinary treat to see the objects that David has pulled together. And it is my great pleasure to introduce David W. Penney. Please give him a rousing and warm Toledo welcome.
Wow, what a fabulous space here. It really is a great privilege to come to Toledo. As Scott said, I feel like this is my home country, and it's a great pleasure to come here. And I want to thank the staff here at the Toledo Art Museum, Brian and all the staff for doing such a fantastic job with this exhibition. I think you're going to treasure it while it's here. It's my job, I think, just to tell you a little bit about some of the impulses, some of the thinking that went into organizing the exhibition. I was approached by the American Federation of Arts and the Dikers, it was probably about 2011 or so, almost 4 years ago, to think about this exhibition. And in discussions, I of course knew the Dikers a little bit, of course got to know them much, much better over the past several years. But through our conversations, we really came upon sort of three themes, three ideas that we thought we'd like to explore in the concept in developing the exhibition. One is this notion of beauty. Beauty in the sense that the aesthetic quality of the objects, the kinds of things that really drew the Diker's attention, that is an avenue of connection. The notion of beauty and art, a connection between the native worlds and the outside world for quite some time. It's a bridge, it's a connection for mutual understanding that invites deeper consideration. The second theme had to do with diversity. As Brian mentioned, there are, in the United States alone, I think 567 federally recognized tribes. The 567th, by the way, was just recognized, I think, last week. And those are the Pamunkey, our neighbors in Washington, D.C., just to the south, who inhabit the oldest reservation in the United States, but had only been recognized by Virginia, and only achieved federal recognition, as I say, quite recently. So this is all very active. This is not something of the past, but something very much of the here and now. And then the third theme, of course, was the idea of knowledge. And that bridge of beauty, that bridge of aesthetic relationships, being an invitation to explore more deeply the cultural considerations, the ideas, and the individuals and personalities of artists as they've created these wonderful things that have been preserved into the present day. So the Dikers really approached this material from the standpoint of being extremely accomplished collectors of modern and contemporary art. It really was the visual aspects of the aesthetic considerations of these objects that drew their eye. That, as I mentioned, has frequently been a kind of a gateway, a bridge. And we can certainly appreciate these three objects are featured in the exhibition, and you can see them in the galleries. The great range of different kinds of materials, sculptural qualities, visual and graphic qualities that are included in the objects that are represented by just these three of the many objects that are included. And it's interesting to kind of draw these sorts of relationships between these objects and the kinds of objects that perhaps at one time were more familiar to the Dikers, that had trained their eye to seek similar qualities in the American Indian objects that they collected. So you see the painting by Francis Bacon with its very expressive abstraction of the figure, the investigation of depth and pattern and non-representational abstraction represented by the fabulous Piet Mondrian, which is at the Museum of Modern Art. And then, of course, 20th century artists themselves were quite interested, very interested in qualities of American Indian art. So Adolf Gottlieb, after viewing a very important landmark exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in the early 1940s, was inspired to create the pictographic series of paintings of the kind you see here. So these were the kinds of visual relationships that I think all of us can see, and reflect in some degree the kinds of impulses that we can see in the objects as well. So the expressive quality of figural extraction, the idea of order and composition that are represented in beadwork and non-representational abstraction, or the kinds of mystery and aura evocative of the kinds of pictographs that you see in this engraved, or pardon me, embroidered bag and blackened deerskin that you see over here. There's always, and these are the kinds of themes that were explored by Bill Rubin, the curator at the famous curator at the Museum of Modern Art, in his exhibition Primitivism in 20th Century Art, which actually I had the privilege to install the Detroit Institute of Arts in the early 1980s, just up the road from here. But there are these are the kinds of questions that one offer. But often, the American Indian art in this kind of guise is positioned as something primitive, something of the past, something that perhaps modern civilization has lost, something that modern artists have tried to recapture through their study of these kinds of objects, qualities of our human capacities that perhaps modern urban existence has led us to forget. These are the kind of immediate sorts of avenues of thought and consideration that sometimes one encounters in comparing modern art with American Indian art. But we can go actually much deeper than that. And one of the ways we might go a little bit deeper is to think about actually the modern qualities that seem obscured in some ways of the native creations that are featured in this exhibition. So we looked at this a little bit at this black buckskin bag over here. It's made out of deer skin. It's embroidered on the surface with porcupine quills, which are dyed and then folded in different patterns and stitched to the surface to create this kind of geometric band here, or can create little pictographs like this thunderbird here in the center. There's a small figure over here, or the turtle. This particular bag was owned by a fairly famous Ojibwa individual, a man named Peter Jones, who we see over here, who is photographed wearing the bag. You can see he's wearing clothing also of deer skin and also decorated with porcupine quill. But you can just see the lower portion of the bag here on his lap. Peter Jones was an Ojibwa man, Anishinaabe. Actually, he was raised in the Toronto area and of the Great Lakes region. But he converted as a young man to Christianity. He became a Methodist and one of the first native ordained Methodist priests. And the occasion of this photograph actually was a trip, one of actually, I think the third trip he had taken to Great Britain to raise money for Methodist missionaries and their work in North America. So as he would travel in Great Britain and lecture and preach and raise money, he would wear an outfit that was made for him by his home community back in the Toronto area, which included this jacket, pardon me, the jacket and the bag that you see here. He's photographed here in 1845, actually so here's across the Atlantic, gone by a steamship, traveling and almost dressing up as an Indian in order to meet the expectations of his of the potential donors. He said actually that he kind of resented having to play this role, and he wrote private letters back to his wife saying that he really didn't like having to dress up in this outfit, as he said. But actually, he later on in his life would he owned this object, this bag, and he would feature it in exhibitions in the Toronto area until it finally sort of circulated out of sight until it ended up later, much later, in the Diker collection. But he is photographed here in Edinburgh, Scotland, by the famous photographers David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson, who are some of the earliest photographers in the new and revolutionary photography method of calotype that was invented by Henry Fox Talbot and actually licensed only 4 years before. So here, this is cutting edge technology of this particular time. This is the earliest photograph ever of an American Indian. And you think that on the surface of that, you would see some kind of glimpse into some primitive past. But no, we see Peter Jones, the earnest Methodist minister, traveling through Great Britain, raising money to continue his efforts at home. Nevertheless, the bag that he's wearing and the clothing he was wearing was made by women back in his home community. And it turns out they've been making bags like this for generations. And it was actually the custom of artists women artists in the Toronto area to make these kinds of bags as gifts and presentations to important outsiders. So no less than Frederick Haldeman, who was essentially the commander-in-chief of the British forces for the Revolutionary War, was presented one by his native allies. Arndt Schuyler de Peyster, who was the resident commandant in Detroit, also during the Revolutionary War, received a bag just like this one, very much like this one. And Sir John Caldwell, who also served in the military down in Amherstburg, just upriver from here, also received a bag like this. So it was probably with great honor that the bag was presented to Peter Jones on the occasion of his trips to Great Britain to raise money. But it just shows how closely he was tied not only to his traditional world of his past, but also the world of the future. and the world that was beginning to become far more global, even in that date more than a century ago in 1845. There are other kind of notable figures, artists that were involved with big global events, big events in American history. So the American Indian history, American Indian art is really a part of American history and American art. And too often has been thought of as a kind of primitive, perhaps, foundation for American civilization, without the understanding that American Indian culture, American Indian history is deeply embedded and intertwined with American history, even up through today, as I mentioned, with a Pamunkey recognition just happened last week. This artist is also represented in the exhibition. If you go upstairs, you'll see this marvelous painted shield. It's made out of has a leather cover, which has been painted with this image of a thunderbird who's a personification of thunderstorms and thunder and lightning. You can see the thunder emanating from his wings. Stories also talk about lightning flashing from his eyes. So the artist who made this was a man named No Two Horns. He was a Lakota, and as a young man fought with Lakota against the federal soldiers at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and a number of other skirmishes. But later in his life, and this was his shield, and he made several of them later in his life. But the shield design was given to him as a result of a personal vision quest. He went off by himself as a young man, fasted for 4 days, and experienced a vision like a dream where he was given this design by the powers above, thunder powers above, which would be used for a shield, which would then protect him in battle. Later in his life, when he became more elderly and certainly was no longer involved with fighting, he would recount those battle scenes. So he did a whole series of drawings, like you see the one here on paper, where he's showing, in this instance, where he rescued a fellow combatant who had lost his horse, lost his mount, and they're riding off in the distance. Crow warriors are shooting rifles, and you can see the bullets whisking by. But prominent in his identity and identifying this heroic act is the same shield you see up here. On one occasion in battle, his horse was terribly wounded. So he carved a horse stick, like one you see here, which he would dance with at public ceremony, which shows the wounds received by his horse in battle, an effort to recognize the valor of his horse. And here is No Two Horns photographed in 1924 as an elderly man, but very much part and parcel of the fabric of American history. And we have other objects in this exhibition, in the collection, that allude to these big events in American history, the Battle of Little Bighorn, for example. This is a large, almost monumental painting, I think about 8 feet in length, painted on cotton. It's upstairs in the gallery, and it's was created by another veteran of the battle, a man named Standing Bear, who was Lakota. And it shows episodes that he experienced himself in the context of the battle. And it was the custom of Plains men to create on their and sometimes on their clothing, on their robes, sometimes engraved in stone and on prominent places, but then later on paper, as we saw with No Two Horns and books, or in large cotton muslins, as you see here, to record the important military activities of their life, their accomplishments. So here was a participant and eyewitness to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. You know, the kind of battle Custer's regiments were wiped out, and the customary to say, well, no one lived to tell the tale, only the other 3,000 Cheyenne and Lakota who are participating. And we actually have quite detailed accounts of exactly what happened. And Standing Bear actually was interviewed many times by historians of the battle. And he's recalling in this painting and in his testimony in these interviews a particular early part of the battle when Company C became kind of isolated at the top of a coulee and tried to make a stand. But the combined Cheyenne and Lakota were able to run off their horses, as you see here on the left-hand side. Here's the village down below, and of course the river valley of the Little Bighorn. And the men, some of the soldiers panicked Standing Bear wrote, and he testified, and began to run down the coulee to try to escape, but then they were killed by native warriors with clubs and guns and spears and bows and arrows. You see them running in a panic down here. So these are experiences that he had individually. But when you look at this painting, and I actually had the occasion of traveling, my wife's Italian, and we were in Rome recently visiting her family. We went to the fantastic Museum of Modern Art in Rome. I know you customly go to, the Colosseum and all these other, they have actually a wonderful museum of modern art, Italian modern art. And I saw this painting, which is actually the sort of the Italian Battle of the Little Bighorn, actually the Battle of Dogali in Ethiopia about the same time, actually 1885, where Italian soldiers were overwhelmed by Ethiopians who were resisting Italian colonial efforts, imperialist efforts in Africa. And reminded me also of the British misfortune in South Africa at the Battle of Isandlwana in South Africa in 1879, when a large British military force was overwhelmed by Zulu in their attempt to, in their efforts to preserve their homeland and protect their homeland. And of course, our own, in this nation, a Battle of Little Bighorn has been commemorated by many painters. A favorite topic, Frederick Remington, no less, among them, as you see over here. And they begin to see these kinds of events. So the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Battle of Isandlwana, the Battle of Dogali in a larger sort of global context, and this modern moment in which imperialist powers coming out of Europe are beginning to kind of these massive moments of resistance by indigenous people and trying to settle what was going to become the modern world, the global world that we experience today. And they become this moment in history which becomes then commemorated in large nationalist mythologies, valorizing the savage foe in some sense, but also emphasizing the price in blood that these nations, the United States, South Africa, Great Britain, and Italy paid in their imperialist efforts, and become kind of a part of a nationalist myth. We're used to seeing these kinds of impulses in modern history painting of the late 19th century, perhaps less accustomed to thinking of native creations of the same time in that same kind of light. The participation in the creation of this large collective nationalist mythology about our origins, who we came from, where we came from, and our struggles to become what we are today. And I would only insist that Native artists, Native nations are very much part of this story in the United States, not simply something of the foundational past. There are two other artists I would talk about just briefly that sort of emphasize this idea of this engagement with the modern world and their response with artistic creativity. Both of these objects you see on the right are featured in the exhibition, and they really represent great masterworks, really the height of accomplishment of the two artists that I'll be speaking about. One, of course, is Elizabeth Hickox, which you see here. She is a Wyatt Karok woman who lived in Northern California in the Klamath Valley. She learned basket making from her mother, Polly Conrad Steve, who was a Wyatt woman and actually, as a young girl, survived the massacre that took place in the Humboldt Bay area just outside of the town of Eureka. California actually suffered tremendously under this kind of colonialist expansion in the mid part of the century. With the gold rush in 1849, very quickly becoming a state in 1851. But California more or less declared race war on Native people at that time, raising money through bond sales to fund vigilante groups that are basically intended to kill Indians. In the Klamath Valley, actually the surviving Indians in 1860 or so gathered on what was called Indian Island, and there were attacked in the middle of the night. Luckily, Elizabeth Hickox's mother survived, but Polly Conrad Steve was kidnapped by, later in her life, still as a young woman, was kidnapped by a white gold miner and kept as a wife and a domestic. Elizabeth Hickox is the issue, is the child of that marriage. She ended up married also a mixed blood man who had inherited his father's gold stake in the Klamath Valley. So as an adult, she actually lived a fairly comfortable existence with her husband's family, but she became known as one of the great basket makers of her generation. And she and her mother and her daughter created baskets that became the subject of a kind of a basketry craze throughout America, with this interest in arts and crafts. Actually, Indian baskets were featured in fashion magazines and household magazines. People would often have in their homes Indian corners with their own little collections of baskets and pottery. And so Elizabeth Hickox is really part of that story as well. And then down here we have a photograph of one of the most famous Pueblo potters of the early part of the 20th century, Nampeo, who actually was a Tewa. She actually came from a different Pueblo, married into the Hopi, and learned her pottery traditions actually from her family. But at the time she moved to Hopi in the middle of the 19th century, because of the importation of kettles and pots and so on, pottery making was very much on the decline. Coming from a very vigorous pottery tradition of her own, she actually worked with archaeologists who were excavating sites in the area, studied old ancient Hopi sherds that were available to her, and revived Hopi pottery making in the 1880s and 1890s. She became extremely famous, and her descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so many of whom are potters today, created a kind of dynasty of pottery making, defining Hopi pottery style for the 20th century. And a very kind of way of looking at the past, but being very inventive and in terms of looking to the future as well. So these, in a sense, these are, the objects are responsive to the training and traditions of the past, but are very forward-looking in terms of being made for the market and forward-looking for their generation. Elizabeth Hickox, for example, invented this basketry shape. It's her own invention with a little lid and the knob on top. She said she was inspired by teapots in the creation of this. So I would argue that these kinds of objects are really sort of a modern art of the United States as it's emerging out of the 19th century into the 20th century. And of course, these kinds of traditions of engagement with the arts continue today. And also very forward-looking in the sense of being savvy in terms of techniques and materials, marketing strategies, copyrights. Actually purposely selected this image off her website, which includes the watermark, the copyright. Rhonda Holy Bear, really one of the great beadworkers working today, is no fool about that. She's a businesswoman, as well as one of the most accomplished beadworkers of her generation. And here she is over in her a photograph of her with her creation. She's actually a Cheyenne River Sioux, but in this particular object, she chose to create an object in the style of one of the neighboring tribes, the Crow or the Absaroka, which are their neighbors to the west. So American Indian art is not something simply of the past. It's not something simply that is being preserved, but American Indian art is something very much of history and change and innovation, and is very much lively and part of the art scene today. So I invite you to look at the marvelous objects that we've assembled upstairs with those kinds of eyes, not looking for some kind of traditional primitive past, but looking for art that was very much contemporary for its time, even if it was made 300 years ago. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. We're at the part of the evening where we are honored to invite to the stage Charles and Valerie Diker. So please give them another round of applause as they make their way to the stage. Museum Director Museum Director Brian Kennedy will moderate a conversation. And if we could have the lights up on the chairs and the stage. And while we're getting set for this conversation, I just wanted to let you know and invite you to join us tomorrow evening for the official celebration in honor of the exhibition. It starts at 6 and continues until 9 p.m. tomorrow evening. After the conversation, I will have the great privilege of introducing our American Indian guests who are with us tonight. They will be part of a ceremony at 6 p.m. We also will have dancers from the Zibawing Center of Anishinaabe Culture and Lifeways from Mount Pleasant, Michigan, who will be doing some traditional songs and dances tomorrow evening as well. So I encourage you to join us, and then on Saturday at 3 p.m. for a tour of the exhibition with David Penney. So I turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Scott. David, thanks for that talk, and you started by saying that the exhibition and the collecting have been gathered around 3 principles. So I wanted to ask Chuck and Valerie about those 3 principles. So one was beauty, another was diversity, and another was knowledge. So how do those 3 aspects weave together, can I ask you?
I will tell you, but can I say something first?
You can say anything you want.
Coming from New York, there's this myth in New York that there's New York and the rest of the world. But coming out here to Toledo and meeting you and seeing what you've done here with this museum and seeing the grandiosity of this museum and being in this hall, which is so unlike anything we have in New York, I'm just in awe. And I just want you to know that this is a very special thing. And if everyone in America could see what I saw here in Toledo, Toledo would have a completely bigger image in everyone's eyes than they have right now. I had to say that, so.
Well,
now,
you know,
now
just
let's
to
answer
say,
your
if there's
question.
anybody in the audience who knows big companies, there are lots of buildings here that you could just move straight into and have a great museum as well. Okay. Thanks.
So, well, the main feature, the main motivation we had in collecting Native American art was the diverse beauty that we saw in the entire field. We had originally collected modern art, we still do, and then became involved with pre-Columbian in the late 60s. And once you get through that and you understand that you're buying art for the object itself and not for the artist, because there were no artists that you're known in pre-Columbian, we had broken that mold. And then when we got to Santa Fe in the early 70s, we discovered Native American art, and it just blew us away. And so we put our efforts into Native American art because we saw such great diversity and beauty. And I guess
when we started collecting, the dealers would say, well, what do you collect? Do you collect baskets? Do you collect pots? And we surprised them by saying, we collect everything as long as it's really beautiful. And they understood, and they have helped us put this collection together.
So in thinking about the collection and thinking about Native American art, and why we call this collection, or why the AFA called the collection Indigenous Beauty, is that beauty is something that was part and parcel of the Native American culture and life. There wasn't a name for art in Indian language. Beauty was in their DNA. It was part of their heart. It was part of their whole spirit. And unfortunately, I don't think beauty plays as important a part in our life today as it did to them, because everything they did was beauty. Today we have the competition from the digital world and from data and from numbers. And while we still play with beauty, it doesn't dominate our lives the way it did to Native Americans. And what appeals to us so much is that every object that we have been able to acquire, and I think you'll see that when you go into the exhibition, that beauty is the dominant factor. You look at something and you can keep looking at it, and what makes art a great piece of art is that every time you look at something, you see something different. If you don't see something different, then it becomes decorative. It really isn't what I consider to be an outstanding work of art.
Then there are others that approach the Native American work as ethnography, and that's important, what these objects were used for. But when you think of these beautiful baskets, whether they were tight enough to hold water, or whether they held beans, was fine, but it was their beauty that attracted us to them.
David, you've talked about technique, and particularly that techniques were passed down. They had to be learned from someone else. And there was a lot of knowledge about materials and what time of the year to gather them. Can you talk a little bit more about technique and the exhibition?
Well, many of the objects, many of the objects in the exhibition were made by artists who were trained in the tradition that you can't learn without being a participant. You can't watch a YouTube video, you can't, learn it sort of casually. But these are traditions of art making that are passed down from one generation to the next, often learned from an elder and then passed on to the younger generation. And it might include things with, of course, with pottery. In the Southwest, the sources of the clay, how to mix the clay with temper properly, how to build the vessel appropriately, and the appropriate shapes and so on. It was interesting, however, though, that an anthropologist who studied this many years ago, Ruth Bunzel, when she was studying just these kinds of technique, this kind of issue of how do you learn to make a Zuni pot? She was working among the Zuni Pueblo artists in the early 1920s. And so all the young women would learn all these techniques, but when it came to painting the design, the elders would say, no, dream of your design. So there was always baked into this opportunity for personal creativity, personal innovation as well. The interesting thing is that what she discovered, however, is that Zuni girls tend to dream of Zuni pots. Only in the sense that the community is fairly insular, and that everyone knows one another. It's a kin-based, community-based, kinship-based community. So that when you're growing up and you're seeing all those pots around you, something that was made by the Pueblo, a few 100 miles away, that doesn't look like a pot, that looks like something else. So when they would dream of Zuni-style pots, but there was an opportunity then to create one's own personal embellishment, one's own stamp on the object. And that's how the tradition stays fresh. Every generation renews that tradition for its own time and place.
David, can I ask you a question? What do you think Zuni boys dream of?
Zuni girls.
What?
Zuni girls.
I would thought.
When you speak of knowledge, I'm reminded of, you'll see a lot of quill work in the pieces, in the leather pieces, and some others. You saw some in these objects that were pictured. And knowledge learned from the elders of how to prepare porcupine quills. Quill work came long before beadwork began, and you had to learn to take the porcupine quill and draw it through your teeth till it got flat, and then apply it in a design of your choice. It was only when the traders from Europe reached our shores with beads that the Indians began trading furs for beads. Beads were much easier and less labor intensive. We have some pieces that combine the porcupine quill, which is wrapped around horsehair and then applied. And some of our pieces show both skills. And we found that not only beautiful, but very interesting.
I read in an interview that you gave, it's now 2016, that back in the early 1960s, your good friends, the Solomons, are here. Right. You took an interest in art and in art collecting. How did that start so early? I mean, you were at Harvard, Chuck, and Val, you were at Smith. and you came and met together. You're still together. It's been an incredible journey. Talk a little bit about how that happened.
Well, when Dick and I were both at Harvard College together, and then we went to Harvard Business School and became roommates at business school. And I was this young 21-year-old, and Dick, his parents were great collectors, and he had a great interest in art, and they would send things up to our room, and I would look at these things. I had no knowledge. I took Fine Arts 13 at the college, but I really didn't have any feeling for art. And to live with this through Dick's ownership of it was just, you know, an eye-opening for me. And then Dick was, during that time and after we got out of business school, he was beginning to buy pop art and other kinds of modern art, and he was so ahead of his time. And I was looking at what he was doing. I was trying to understand, what was he doing? What was he buying, this stuff that I had any knowledge of? But anyway, I decided if he was doing it, well, maybe I should do it too. So I began to go, Val and I began to go to galleries on Saturday and start to learn and look, and he just got the bug. And I began to understand what he was doing. So we started to collect modern art, and of course—
We used to go out on Saturdays when it rained, because we were young and the gallery owners didn't take much interest in us. But when it was raining, their big customers stayed home. So we could chat with them and learn really lots and lots of things.
So that was how we got involved with modern art, and that was how we got involved. And then, of course, I started out my life at Revlon, working for the president of the company. And I have another good friend here, Leonard Lauder, who wouldn't talk to me in the 60s because I was working for the competitor. But we've become very dear friends since then. But at Revlon, I was very involved in packaging and design, display and advertising, and it got me more and more into the aesthetics. So it was the combination of the way my career was taking off and what I had garnered from being with Dick and Ann, I should say, got us very interested in continuing this tradition of trying to become more and more involved. It just spoke to us, and we felt so comfortable. We began to see things we never saw before. And then, of course, we got involved with pre-Columbian later on in the 60s, and then Native American in the early 70s. And what's great about it is that it all lives so well together. You put Native American art or any antiquity with modern art, certain kinds of antiquities with modern art, and they speak to each other. They play against each other, and I think it's a wonderful way to live. And part of collecting is also how you display it in your own home, and how you can be creative in displaying the art is a very fun part of this whole journey that we've had.
For this book, we've said it was fine to take, I believe there are 2 photographs in the book, Indigenous Art, which were taken, as they say, in situ. That is, of our living room and another room in our house, and you can see the mixture of the 2. We love to change the things around, whether they're paintings or objects, and they get a new life. Some of you may have had that experience. It's quite amazing. But some of the galleries we would go into would say, well, when we went in, we almost always loved the same things. It was amazing. And that's been a large part of a very long marriage, to have the pleasure of— Chuck worked in Midtown, and he would go in on his lunchtime and ask the proprietor to possibly put 2 or 3 things away. And then he'd call me and he'd say, "You've got to get down here. It's a great exhibition," whatever it was. And I would come down, and almost without fail, I would pick at least 1, if not 2, of the things he had put aside without knowing it. And that was wonderful cement, aesthetic cement, if you will.
It's called glue, Val.
You're such a fascinating couple. I mean, different aspects. You know, the fact that apparently Perfume Charlie is named after you, right?
Well, no,
Is that right?
unfortunately, the name of the founder and chief executive officer of Revlon, his name is Charles Revson. So I was Charles II, he was Charles I. And Charlie was named after Charles I. Please, we cannot.
Okay.
I can't take credit for that.
Destroyed a good story, all right? We'll have
I have to be truthful, though, don't I?
So just to spin over, just to the degree of just attention to ambition that you have, I mean, the idea that you are one of the great breeders of dachshunds, including the top breed at the Westminster Show. I mean, that is amazing. I mean, just a whole other thing. Now, I say that here because Northwest Ohio loves dogs, right? Absolutely. We have a great dog painter who's one of the founders of this museum, Mr. Osthaus. But these sort of aspects, your lives are so rich, and your apartment is astonishing. I mean, there's a Rothko over here, and the Nevelsons there, and then a basket here, and then you're pointing here and here. So it brings me to the point. In an early discussion about you, Chuck, it talked about your work in the perfume makeup industry. If that's not the right word for it, forgive me. Pardon? The cosmetics industry. Yes, indeed. But it talked specifically in the interview about visual literacy. And we were absolutely taken with that, because the way that you coordinate and the way that you think about differing parts fitting together is totally in sync with what we would aspire to for art education. So could you reflect on that a little bit?
Well, it's a very personal thing. By the way, before I get into that, would you like to buy a dachshund? We're long on dachshunds.
We're big on Australian Labradoodles. Yeah, yeah, okay. But thank you. Yeah.
So,
Westminster is on Monday, and
so it's
we're
visual literacy.
And the sense that you have that, you know, that these two collections, for example, the way they fit together, the way the things work together. I mean, your concept of what you mean by beauty, why is that so important?
Well,
I
have certain talents and I have certain faults. I mean, I know what I'm good at and I know what I'm not good at. And what I'm reasonably good at is to create something new and to innovate on something. And I found in searching myself that I can both be active in creating something and also react to other people's creativity and beauty. And so what I found is that when an artist is creative, or when there's something new and innovative in a work of art, whether it's Native American or modern art or Japanese art, I respond to it tremendously. I'd love to see something taking it to the new level, to the next stage. And the artists that we have, we might not have been the first ones to buy it when they were doing that, but we own them because we feel they were part of the development of art history. And what we see in Native American art is, you know, early on thinking, as David pointed out, that what they were doing in the 19th century, I mean, the amount of abstraction that you see in 19th century Indian art is amazing. And when you worry, and you know, when they had the abstraction show at the MoMA, you wonder where abstraction came from. I mean, you know, it was going on certainly in other parts of the world too, earlier than the 19th century, but certainly you can see so much of it in Native American art. And when you can see pieces, as you'll see upstairs, or is it downstairs? I don't even know, where are we? Where's the show, upstairs? It's down?
Well, actually, it's here.
Oh, it's on this floor?
Oh.
This floor, yeah.
So when you see pieces where you juxtapose abstraction with realism in the same piece, to us that was a very sophisticated thing, that they were doing this in the 19th and 18th century, and we found that mind-blowing, that you know, that was modern art, and to us even today it's modern art, because it was a very sophisticated form of imagery. And so
You could see on the beaded bag that we saw before, the geometric pattern of it. There's nothing new under the sun. They were there first, and they did it beautifully.
In an interview, just to end, Chuck, you said that the visual and intellectual aspects of art give you a fulfillment that business doesn't. It helps you replenish your soul with what you're looking at when you come home or go to galleries and museums. Would you both like to reflect on that and the importance of art museums?
Well, I think that's very important for anyone who wants to become involved with art. I mean, you have your profession. Now, if you're in the profession of business, which is what I'm in, you're dealing with things that aren't necessarily spiritual or fulfilling your body, your heart. You're dealing with numbers. You're dealing with tangible objects that you're designing and building and selling. But it's all for one cause, and now there's certainly in one of the companies I'm involved with, we're trying to help society with our products because we try to prevent infection. So that has an end result which is beyond making profits for the corporation. But in most cases, people who are in business are in it for the profit-making aspect of it. And that's not necessarily an enriching thing of your soul. So when you can come home and look at your art, which is
A different world.
well, it's more than a different world. It is enriching. It is, there's no tension. There's no, it's like something that you look at and you see different things and you can become very spiritual about it. And very often when I can't sleep at night and get up and, I go out in the living room and just sit there and just gaze at these things, I get relaxed because I see things that really mean a lot to me and enrich my soul, and you don't get that when you're in your profession. So it is a great outlet for your tensions and for your everyday life, which in New York, by the way, is pretty tense. So anyway.
When I went to the exhibition, which I recommend, it's just more than we ever could have dreamed of. The objects look more beautiful than they've ever looked before, and we hope that you'll agree with us. But when I went in the exhibition and I looked at the Alali perfect round basket with embroidery as part of it, I felt very spiritual. I felt the spirituality of the woman who made it so many years ago, because I know there was no drawing, there was no pattern. It came from her innermost being, from her soul and her heart, and it really touched mine all over again. We've owned that basket for many years, and when I saw it inside in this museum, it had even a greater effect on me than it had when I first saw it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Charles and Valerie. We really look forward now to going to see the exhibition. We want to express our deep gratitude to you. This is an extraordinary opportunity for us in an art area that we haven't actually exhibited, in an area of collecting that we haven't collected, but in an area of the country where there are such deep roots. So can I ask you to express your enthusiasm?
I would like to, may I say one thing?
Yeah.
I think an institution is very much determined by what's on top and what the direction is from on top. And having met you, Brian, your passion and your scholarship and your knowledge is so overwhelming that I must tell you how much I've enjoyed meeting you and being with you, and what you have done with our collection is beyond anything I saw in any of the other 3 venues we were in. So I want you to know that it's been a privilege to know you.
Thank you.
And the only thing I would say is watch out for your socks.
He told me earlier you sock it to them, so here you go. All right. We want to conclude, thank you, Chuck. We want to conclude by making sure that we resonate with the fact that works of art are made by real people. And the Native American traditions of this country are so strong. So I want to invite Scott Boberg back to welcome our Native American representatives here. Scott.
It is such an honor to provide that history and that historical link with the presentation of this exhibition here in Ohio. So I'm so grateful that we have representation with the presence of the following individuals. So I'm going to indicate who's joined us tonight. There's Richard Zain Smith, a visual ceramic artist from the Wyandot Nation of Oklahoma. Paul Barton, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma. Jamie Oxendine, Director of the Black Swamp Intertribal Foundation of right here in Perrysburg, Ohio. Barbara Mann, who's Associate Professor in the Honors College at the University of Toledo and author of Spirits of Blood, Spirits of Breath, The Twin Cosmos of Indigenous America, which was just released last week by Oxford University Press. I encourage you to look for that. Diane Hunter, Acting Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. And it's my great pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming to the stage to say a few words in advance of our seeing this exhibition to honor its opening here in Ohio. Please give a very warm welcome to Chief Glenna J. Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma.
Thank you so very much for inviting us. 3 of us came from Oklahoma this morning. We actually live in the 4-state area where we started in Oklahoma, went to Missouri, and then it's a wonder we came close to Kansas before we got on the airplane to get here, so that's quite common for us. I can't begin to tell you how honored we are to be here. In the first place, we would probably never see this had it not been for you. And so the invitation is especially meaningful. We live in a world oftentimes of stereotypes, and I know the individual didn't mean anything by it, but when I was introduced to someone earlier this evening, his response was, "Well, you don't talk like a chief." And then his second response was, "And you don't look like a chief." I'm not sure how a chief talks. I'm not sure how a chief is supposed to look. I just simply know who I am. I would talk about my tribe for just a moment to say that we were removed from Ohio in 1832, along with Paul Barton, who is here with us this evening from the Seneca Cayuga tribe, who is our neighbor just about 15, 20 miles from us there in Oklahoma. We were known as the Mixed Band, and when we were removed from Ohio, they sent us to Indian Territory. I am so pleased to see that these works have been preserved, and they're not only simply preserved, they are loved, they are treasured, and that is so meaningful to us because we are a tribe that we almost did not survive. Just before the year 1900, we had only 63 people in our tribe. It was truly an example of almost total genocide. And today we are still a small tribe, but we have gone from the 63 to 3,200. Just as we have grown numerically, and just as we almost vanished and disappeared without people like you, our works would not have survived either. And that is so meaningful to us. I can tell you that oftentimes when I travel, I am gifted with something, and I treasure those gifts, and each is meaningful to me. But so very many times, our culture is associated with male warriors. And so many times what is given to me is a painting of a male warrior or a sculpture of a male warrior. And it is so wonderful because I've taken a few steps into that exhibit. I could have gone further, but I couldn't leave each piece to move on very fast. So the collection is diversified. It does represent some items that would be of the male warrior, but in addition to that, in all of our culture, we have our elders, and they're very important to us. We have our females, and they're very important to us. We have our youth, our babies, and all of this, to some degree, is reflected in this exhibit. So I don't want to speak so much. I really want to tell you the person who should be speaking is Richard Zain Smith, because he is a marvelous artist, and he is a potter, and he thinks in terms of the artist and the creator. I often describe, when people ask me what it is like to be a chief, I say, it's really very simple, that I have two legs, just like you have two legs. And one of those legs must be stretched backward as far as it can be, because that's my culture, that's my history, and it has to stay rooted. I have to know who my people were and are and who I am. The other leg, we wouldn't have more than 63 people if we didn't have a forward leg. And so that other leg has to go forward as fast, as sturdy as it can be to help my people advance. Exhibits like this are rooted in the past, but they bring us to the modern age, and they inspire us to do more. So I am so extremely appreciative of this exhibit, and I am so extremely appreciative of the invitation to be here, and I know I speak for the other people who are as well. So for Richard, for Diane, for Paul, we are honored to be here, and we are honored that you have honored our culture, our people. Thank you so very much.
You may not be able to hear Richard Zain Smith speak, but you'll in a few moments hear Richard Zain Smith sing, because he has brought his water drum, and he will be joined by Paul Barton. So in Libby Court, outside of the exhibition, they will welcome you to the exhibition with some traditional songs from Oklahoma, many of which are linked back to the homelands in Ohio. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us. There are several ways to get to the exhibition from here, but please join me again in welcoming and thanking Charles and Valerie Diker, David Penney, for this extraordinary exhibition.